This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Benchmade Bugout. Yes, it is time for that knife review or rite of passage, which is to review the Bugout. There are sort of 3 or 4 big knives that everybody's got their opinion on, and mine is going to add nothing that you haven't heard before, but hopefully I'll go a little more in depth or just give you an interesting perspective. I think everybody who's watching this video has probably handled the Bugout, probably has an opinion on the Bugout, probably has things they love about the Bugout, probably has things that they don't like about the Bugout, but this has been my experience with the Bugout. My reviews go through in 3 sections. First, we're going to go through the specifications. Then we will look at the knife tip to tail, what's interesting about it, what's not interesting about it. And then we will score it across a 10-point scoring system that lets us sort of compare knives a little more systematically to one another and gives you a better understanding of what I think overall. It's the Benchmade Bugout. Let's just get into it. So the Bugout was Benchmade's sort of big foray into ultra light knives. You know, you would think from the name Bugout, this has sort of camping and sort of ultra light connotations, but honestly has just become an EDC staple over the years, and one of the knives that when you take somebody who is sort of new to the knife industry and wants to get into bigger, better knives, it has sort of become the, okay, what do you give somebody? You tell them to get a Bugout. It has been sort of recently replaced a little bit by that, in that conversation, by the Hogue Deca, or more recently the Kershaw Bel Air, all of which are very clearly rip-offs of the Bugout's overall design and overall sort of form factor. Benchmade has been doing these for years now in many different forms. This here is one of their more recent ones with the gray Cerakote blade and the storm gray grivery handles. But most of the Bugouts out there are some combination of an S30V blade, either satin finish or again with this Cerakote on there, and some color of grivery handle. This Benchmade Bugout, like all Benchmade Bugouts, is made in the US of A. As like all Benchmades, made in the US of A. This one runs retail $180. You can get this exact knife for $162 from a wide range of retailers right now. And then on the secondary market, this is probably about $130, $140 knife. Blade here, 3.24 inches long, 0.09 inches, so 90 thousandths thick on the blade stock. The Bugout is, of course, that's sort of one of its calling cards, is that very thin blade stock. S30V is the seal for this one, which is the seal for most Bugouts, though you can also get them regularly in S90V and less regularly in M4. I'm sure in a couple years they will finally start using MagnaCut on the Bugout, but I don't think even in their reveal they had any MagnaCut Bugouts coming out. Which is interesting because a tool steel makes a lot of sense on a blade this thin, but I digress. 7.46 inches overall, 1.85 ounces, which really speaks to one of the Bugout's sort of most notable features, which is that this is an absurdly light knife. And the pivot, like just about maybe every Benchmade axis lock, certainly every current axis lock they have, is phosphor bronze washers with that axis lock. And of course I can call it an axis lock, not a sliding bar lock, because this is Benchmade we're talking about, and they were the ones that originated it. I feel like size comparisons are a little bit less necessary with the Bugout, because the Bugout is one of the knives that everybody compares against. But there it is against a small Sebenza. You can see it is about the same size as the small Sebenza, and I'm sure not coincidentally so. You can see there are a lot of general similarities in overall form factor, even down to the shape of the blade and parts of the shape of the handle, comparing the Sebenza, which is a very popular EDC choice and has been for many years, and the Bugout. Again, I'm sure that's not entirely a coincidence. Compare it to your PM2, which is another sort of standard, okay, you want a good knife, what should you get? You can see this is the much smaller and certainly much thinner and lighter duty, easier to carry knife than your PM2. Comparing it to another Benchmade standard, here is your Benchmade 940. You can see it is about the same length, just a little bit shorter on both the blade and the handle than the 940, but the blade stock is quite significantly thinner than the 940. The handle is a little bit thinner, it's a good bit lighter, and that overall blade shape is very different. So functionally, it feels very different than the 940, despite being similar in overall size. Comparing it to another lightweight EDC favorite, the Delica, you can see the handle is about the same length as the Delica, though it is a little bit taller, and the blade is a little bit longer. Again, the Delica is a knife that doesn't have necessarily what we would call a modern blade to handle ratio. It's a little long in the handle relative to the size of the blade compared to what we see in modern knives, but the blade stock here is exactly the same. Both of these knives have 90 thousandths blade stocks. They come down to relatively thin tips. Let's see here. I just had my XM18. I just recorded that review before this one. And you can see it is about the same size as your 3-inch XM18, maybe a little bit longer. But if you compare it to a full-size XM18, you can see it is just a significantly smaller knife in general. And this is very much meant to be a small, lightweight, pocketable EDC knife. That is what the Bugout is meant for. Benchmade has sold a bajillion and a half of these. I feel like just about everybody who's watching this channel has probably handled the Bugout at some point. Most of you have probably owned one. The one other thing I'm just going to mention, I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the scoring system. One of the things that has become remarkable about the Bugout in 2024 is the aftermarket for parts that have become available for the Bugout. Obviously, you know, once you've got the blade, that blade is pretty much in place. It costs a lot of money to Cerakote this blade. I mean, you're probably talking $50 to $70 to Cerakote the blade a different color, which doesn't make that much sense to do on a $180 knife. But I've got handle scales here in titanium from Flytanium here. These are their sort of crossfade scales in their Neptune finish. I've got a set of scales here from Putman Scales, bladescales.com. I love these scales. These are aluminum scales with micarta inlays. I used to be one of those guys that would heavily customize my Bugouts. Back when I first started really getting into knives, I had a collection of, I think I peaked at 10 Bugouts, all of which had some variety of aftermarket scales on them. I had scales from Yates, scales from Rock Scale Design, other Putman scales, all sorts of things on there. And it is one of the things that is cool about the Bugout is because there have been so many of them, and because it's sort of a very neutral platform, it has given third parties lots of room to experiment, to do things that are similar to this basic scale design or quite different from this basic scale design. You've got ones like, like Apply Weapons Tech with their Archon scales that goes a completely different direction, makes the Bugout feel very, very different. I'm going to review some of those other scale options separately, but it's just worth mentioning because I think a lot of knife enthusiasts these days will buy the Bugout with the intent to customize it. I'm reviewing the Bugout as it's seen here, but just do keep that in mind that, again, it's something that I'll talk about in a separate video, how the Bugout sort of looks and feels, and especially when you think about it, when you think about value, when you start putting those aftermarket parts on there. But just about every part of this, except for that blade, can be customized fairly easily. And that blade up here is about as standard and basic a drop point as you're going to find. Again, 90,000 of the blade stock, which is quite thin. It's a little, you know what, for the blade, let me take out this Flytanium one. It's a bit easier to see because it's that satin grind. You can see that flat carries out about 2/3 of the way down, and then tapers down to a relatively pointy tip. And then you've got a relatively tall grind here. But if you look at that plunge, especially if you look down at the ricasso, one of the things that you'll notice as you use the Bugout, is it a slicey blade? Yes. But it's not nearly as slicey as it could be. And that is because this is quite a shallow flat grind. There is just not a lot of steel that is removed from when you go to this full thickness down here to when you go down to the edge. And if I compare that to something like the Delica, which has this full flat grind here, way, way slicier knife than the Bugout. Also has a way better factory edge. So blade shape here is, and now that we look at the grind, I can go back to this guy that will look better on camera. Very typical drop point shape. I mean, everything that I've said about drop points applies here too. It's that your tip is a little bit above the pivot. Your belly is mostly in the front third to front half of the blade. There's a flat toward the back. It is a simple, versatile blade shape. It does everything well and nothing exceptionally well. Easy to get down on the table, easy to use in the garden, get around stuff, get into stuff, poke into stuff. There's enough of a pointy tip here that it pierces nicely. It's a bit of a delicate tip, but the whole knife is a little bit delicate, or at least the whole blade is a little bit delicate. For EDC stuff, for boxes, for twine, for zip tie, stuff like that, it will do everything fine. This is the very definition of a basic blade shape. There is nothing interesting about it. The only thing that is interesting about it is the fact that it is just as all around gets. You got Benchmade thumb studs here, which are very nice. If I can get them to focus, yeah, there we go. I really like Benchmade stock thumb studs. When you fold the knife up, they actually stick out slightly less than the scale, so they don't stick out proud at all. But the way that they are designed, they've got relatively sharp little concentric circles there, which grip your thumb very nicely and make it very easy to flick this out with those thumb studs. Very grippy, very easy to actuate. And again, if you hate these thumb studs, for $20-25, you can get aftermarket ones that'll stick out, that can do all sorts of, all sorts of things you want. You want bigger ones, smaller ones, you want dome ones, whatever, you can replace them. It's very easy to replace too. There's a little Torx bit in there, and you can just unscrew those quite easily. This is just a sharpening tool here. It's a perfectly fine sharpening tool. Again, the factory edge on Bugouts is okay. The out-of-the-box performance, slicing performance for a Bugout is good in the sense that it is a thin blade and it is just a thin-stocked, relatively nimble EDC knife, but it is nowhere as good as what you would expect if you're used to other thin stock knives that have truly good grinds and truly good factory edges. Nowhere near the performance of a TRM Neutron, nowhere near the performance of something like a Spyderco Sage or a Spyderco Delica or something like that. It's just not as slicey as those. And that's a consequence of the relatively shallow grind they chose, and just mediocre is a little bit too punitive, but the factory edges are not great. They can be a little uneven, and they're just, even at their best, they're not all that sharp. Easy to fix if you know how to sharpen, but just know that, especially if you're used to things like Spyderco or TRM, some of those brands that really do prioritize sliciness, you're not going to get that same level of sliciness on a Bugout out of the box. And that's pretty much all there is to say about this blade, which brings us to the handle here. The handle is Grivery. Grivery is a very, very lightweight material. You can see it's injection molded, so we've got that sort of boxy, it's basically, it's one of those materials that they can make into these relatively complex shapes. It does flex if you push on it, but you will never notice that flex in use. It's got a very nice texture. It's got this kind of eggshell texture on it that does pick up a lot of, dirt and debris and things like that relatively quickly, but just gives a very nice sort of neutral, it's eggshell is really the correct term for it. It feels like an eggshell. It's very comfortable in the hand. It provides a little bit of extra purchase, a little bit of extra grip. This diamond pattern in here provides even a little bit more grip right where you want it. It's a very nice handle material for anything functional. And it's part of the reason that this knife is so absurdly light. 1.85 ounces for a 3.24 inch blade is absurd. That is among the best in the entire industry. And frankly, some of the only ones that get even better are things like the Tagged Out, which are other Benchmades that use the exact same materials and design. So I really like Grivery. And again, if you hate Grivery, then you can get plenty of Benchmade Bugouts with other handle materials. Your hardware everywhere is very basic, very simple, mostly steel. I think they're all steel screws. They all nest neatly, but if you've ever taken apart and put back together a Bugout, some of them will work their way out over time. They don't all sit exactly the same depth. Sometimes you'll see them poking out into the center of the scales, things like that. Like, the hardware is a bit of an afterthought. It does the job, but there's nothing premium about the hardware. Your access bar access here is sort of like a bigger version of the thumb stud and has that same really nice grippy pattern on it, which makes it very, very easy to actuate. Very easy to pull back. Now, Benchmade does, generally recommend you pull back with both fingers. The actual bar, which you can see there, the whole interface behind this axis lock is not the stiffest thing in the world. And if you get too used to, say, like pulling it with one finger, sometimes it just won't actuate. And you can see it's not quite parallel there. It is a little off kilter. So sometimes if you try to pull it back with one thumb or something like that, it sometimes just won't shut. And even then, over time, it'll start to cause the whole thing to get a little wonky. Not the case with some of the more premium bar locks out there. I can actuate my TRM shadow, or I could actuate my TRM shadow when I had it with one side. I could do it with my Deca. Benchmade's really the only one that still is requiring you to pull with both sides. Again, it's just sort of their level of fit and finish isn't quite where some of the others are. But hey, that's the fact of the matter. Once you get used to pulling it back, it works very nicely. And you get that drop shutty axis lock action that so many people like with Benchmade that you can just fidget with all day. And that is a function of just the geometry of the axis lock. The fact is, when this blade is like this, there's very little that is interacting with the blade, just this little bit of spring tension from the axis lock, which makes it very easy to get a free dropping action that also gives you just enough spring tension on the open. They dial it very nicely that you get almost a detent in that first push there. As you overcome the spring for the axis lock, it is a nice, satisfying detent to overcome. And actually the one part of the axis lock that I still think that Benchmade does particularly well, they do give you a satisfying detent-like feel when you're opening the knife, and it does make the action a little bit more satisfying. This is a 2020 Bugout. I have not had play up, down, side to side with my Bugout, and I have been able to get free dropping action without play. It was the rule for years with Benchmade that you had to pick one. You could either get that free dropping action and have a little bit of blade play, or you could get rid of the blade play, but then you wouldn't have a free dropping action anymore. The Benchmade that I have purchased new in 2024 have all pretty consistently been drop shutty without play. And the fact is, it's always been clear it's been a matter of just Benchmade's tolerances and levels of fit and finish, because even years ago, if you got, say, like rock scale design scales on your Benchmade, those would lock up tight. You would have no play whatsoever and free dropping action. If you got like brass scales from Yates, those would be great. Arcos scales from AWT, those would be great. So it was always a question of like, would Benchmade just put their knives together tightly enough to get that play away? Now it seems like they have started to get there. So previously, every single Bugout I handled had that same issue. There was a little bit of play. It was more that you could feel it than you could see it. It was there. It was never a functional issue, though over time, play does lead to wear and tear on parts. It does lead to things breaking down more easily. It does lead to things, coming apart over time. So it is a concern. It's not something you can totally ignore. But the play was never bad on any recent Benchmades. In this Bugout, it's not there. Handle design is the same on both sides. Handle internals, you've got basically the cartridge to hold your axis lock here. Extends, basically just a little bit past this screw, and then from here on, it's just pure grivery, except for, the threading for the scales and your standoffs here. The handle is a very simple, neutral handle. Nice little sort of, the idea of a finger index here, nice little belly there, Little extra swoop on the back, relatively neutral lanyard hole here, gentle swoop, and then again with these injected molded materials, you can have what is effectively a fully contoured handle. It's a light contour, but there is a contour across the handle and a nice, even, sort of rolling chamfer, just rounding all the way around the edge. This leads to a very neutral, simple feel in the hand. This is as natural and basic a handle as you're going to find. You just grip it and it just naturally rolls right into your fingers just like that. If you want to pinch up on it, you can grab that blade, post your 3 fingers back here, kind of like the blade. This is a very basic but very competent knife handle. It is one of those handles that when you grab it, it will feel plenty good pretty much however you hold it. There is no bad grip for a Bugout. And because it's got that little curve up here, that little curve back here, and it does have that contouring and the grippiness of this handle, it doesn't have the downside of a lot of neutral handles in that it doesn't want to slip out of your hand either. I mean, it's not like a Hinderer or something like that, or it's not like a Spyderco Manix, but this doesn't want to move in my hand all that easily. It does feel quite secure in the hand. The texture on the grivery does a lot of that. These little swoops do a lot of that. The fact that it is a skinny handle, but not crazy, it's not like it's, two thin little slabs. It just rolls into the palm nicely. And whatever I want to do, it's one of those handles that you just don't have to think about. It's very, very easy, easier than almost any other knife. To just pull this out of your pocket, flick it out, your hand just goes wherever it wants to. There's no bad grip. You can pinch it like that. You can grab it like this. You can pinch up on the blade. You can pinch all the way up on the blade. You can sort of put it in your palm like this and use it kind of like that. Like, there is no bad way to grip a Bugout. It's a very well-designed neutral handle. It is very good at exactly what it's meant to be, which is a knife that you can hand to just about anybody, and whatever way they grab it, it will be satisfying to use, satisfying to hold, won't have any hot spots. It just works, and it works just fine. It is not interesting. It is not exceptional at anything. There's no particular grip that is awesome, but there's also no grip that's bad. And sort of the last thing to be said about this Bugout handle is Benchmade's clip. Benchmade sort of was shipping a lot of deep carry clips with their knives before it became really cool. And this is a fantastic clip. Doesn't cause any hot spots. Helps with the ergonomics in that when you grip it, provides a little extra purchase back where it's sort of rolling into the back of your palm. So when you do grip down on it harder, that extra space here just makes it feel a little bit more secure in the hand. It's a relatively short clip that comes in and out of the pocket nicely with some nice spring. Functionally, I love Benchmade's clip. Benchmade's standard clip is just one of the better basic clips in the knife industry. Kind of continuing with the theme of everything in the Bugout, which is that this is just above average competence without being interesting in any particular way. And so with that sort of general overview, let's go to the scores. And I think you can probably guess, based on what I've been saying, where a lot of these scores are going to end up. My camera's a little too close, so let's just zoom that out. And then let's just get some stuff to hold down these edges here, because this particular piece of overhead doesn't really want to play nicely. Okay, and then let's zoom back in, and there we go. All right, so I rate knives at across 10 sort of factors, 5 of which are knife enthusiast factors. How fun is it? How fun is it to have, to hold, to use, all that sort of stuff. And then 5 which are related to its utility. First fun factor, the blade design. B- on this blade design. This is a basic spear point. It is a totally functional basic spear point. And the fact is, they could have gone even less basic if they wanted to. Like, they did add this little swedge here, which makes it look a little cooler. They did make it, a saber grind, not a full flat grind, which makes it a little bit tougher than this blade stock could have been. And the fact is, having 90 thousandths blade stock on a simple drop point like this is just very simply useful and functional. It is in line with the Bugout ethos, a good blade shape that is great in no particular way. There's nothing that interesting about it. It's not like they mailed it in. It's very thoughtfully just utilitarian and versatile. It's fine. It's fine. It's a B-. It's fine without being interesting in any particular way. Handle design, same thing. When you look at it from a design perspective, honestly, when you stop messing about the fact that it flexes a little bit when you push on it, grip rubber is a really nice material. And the way that they designed this handle, it is a very well-designed neutral handle. It gives you just enough grip where you want it. It gives you just enough places to put your hand that it feels more secure than a lot of poorly designed neutral handles. I think people don't give the Bugout quite enough credit because it is non-trivial to design a good neutral handle that isn't just a stick. Because a neutral handle that is just a stick is not going to feel good in the hand. It's not going to feel secure, and it's going to look boring. This is not a stick. Every angle and aspect of this has been designed, has been thought through, including the use of the material and the pattern that was put in the material. This is a handle design that is completely uninteresting, but it also very much is a handle design that anybody can pick up and immediately understand how to grip it and can feel comfortable using it. And that's cool. It's still a B- because frankly, this is a knife enthusiast channel and I'm not going to give it too much credit for that versatility, but it's not a bad handle design in any way, shape, or form. And I do think there is more good to it than bad to it. Action in 2024 is a B. Because again, my experience with Benchmades in 2024 is that they have finally managed to get this drop shutty action, or at least shake shutty action. If you really shake it, then you can get it to drop. They managed to get this action, which is quite satisfying and as fidgety as just about any knife out there. Maybe some of the Demko Shark Clock give it a run for their money now, but it's up there still. They've gotten that action without blade play. That's great. It's a solid B. It is still one of the most fun and fidgety actions that you're going to find out there. Cool. Fit and finish is a B-. In fact, I'm actually going to take that handle design. I think it's a little too positive. I'm going to call it a B because I really do think that people don't give it enough credit. And I think that a B- is a little too harsh. Fit and finish is definitely a B- though. The screws in particular feel totally mailed in on this knife. And every single time I, go to take my Bugouts apart and put them back together, this particular one doesn't have any screws hanging out on the interior, but most of my others, actually you can even see that screw there is hanging out just a little bit. Oh no, that's not a screw, that's just a burr. Okay, well, still served my point. There's always like a couple screws where I could see a few threads hanging in there. They're not ever quite flush to the same depth. When you put a Bugout back together, there's always that process of tinkering the tension on all these screws. There's nothing tight and robust about this knife. The fact is, it works. The blade grinds are totally competent. The handle design is totally competent. But it's just like, it's kind of there. This is honestly a borderline C+, but a C+ feels a little too harsh when there are so many knives out there that are just badly made. And this one is just sort of finicky. It's just not tight. They're not trying to do tight, but $180 isn't cheap. And put it this way, most Spydercos are made significantly tighter and significantly better put together. Or to use a knife that is, right at hand here, this Spyderco Delica, which is $60 cheaper than the Bugout, feels more solidly put together and more consistent, and like it has better hardware and a slightly fancier blade grind and all that than the Bugout does at probably $40 to $60 cheaper or more expensive depending on the variant. So that's a B- bordering on a C+. And the cool factor, I thought about giving the cool factor of the Bugout much worse than a B- because this is about as basic as a knife can get in 2024. And that's partially because the Bugout is a victim of its own success. Like, the Bugout is partially so boring just because Benchmade has sold so many Bugouts. And so everybody's had an experience with the Bugout. And so the Bugout is boring just because it's familiar. And the Bugout has created a category. It is one of those knives that is like, your ProTech Malibu, which is sort of the close example I can think of another one that is so clearly created an entire category of knives. I mean, again, you think about the Hogue Deca and the Bel Air are two of the sort of knives that everybody has been talking about last year and this year, respectively. They are ripoffs of the design philosophy of the Bugout. They are very literally trying to take what the Bugout did well and trying to do it better. That's because this is a great sort of knife. And so even though everything about this knife is boring, it's also satisfying in a way because it just is so darn useful. It's so darn approachable to everybody. And then on top of that, I think at some points in cool factor just because of that aftermarket, because that aftermarket is so rich. And if you're willing to put in the money and you're willing to put in the time and you're willing to deal with a slightly finicky assembly and disassembly, you can make some legitimately very cool Bugouts. And some people that really invest into tricking out their Bugouts can make some very, very cool looking knives. You tend to lose some of the things that make the Bugout interesting from a utilitarian perspective. It starts to get heavier, the ergonomics start to fall apart, things like that, but you can make some Bugouts that are very, very cool. I'm still going to give it a B- because it's still a boring knife. But I don't think it's nearly as boring as a lot of knife enthusiasts say it is. I see lots of people sort of roll their eyes at the Bugout and say like, oh, whatever, it's just a Bugout. It's the equivalent of like our Milwaukee Fastback once you're a knife enthusiast, where it's like, this is the knife I just throw in there and I have so that I have a knife everywhere and I just don't care about it. Like, this is still a really good design. It takes a lot of thought and it takes a lot of a very good design eye to make something that is seeing the incredible mass appeal that the Bugout has. And I think that there's some cool factor in that. So, the overall fun factor on the Bugout is a B-, and that feels totally right. This is a knife that is interesting for pretty much nobody, except for those people that trick it out. But it is a knife that is acceptable for pretty much everybody, with the exceptions being either historically, people that were really finicky about fit and finish. Those fit and finish issues were severe enough that the Bugout was just a non-starter for them, or people that are just knife snobs and don't like things that are purely utilitarian, that have an issue with a cheaper material like Grivery, or just want things to all be, titanium and metal and stuff like that. Those are the people that have hated on the Bugout so much. Or people that are just trying to want it to be something that it is not. Want it to be sort of a hard use knife or something that is beefy or something that feels heavy. Like, that's not what the Bugout is trying to be. It's trying to be something you can carry with you all the time. And by the way, in terms of toughness, this actually is a very tough knife. The axis lock, the blade, even the Grivery scales are actually very tough. They can take an enormous amount of abuse. You could take a hammer to these scales, and they will probably, because they will bend, not break, respond to blunt force better than a lot of your aluminum scales. Like, these are probably actually less tough scales than these Grivery scales are. Even though they're a lot more fun, they make the action better, they're more satisfying in the hand. These are probably a downgrade functionally compared to the Grivery ones. And by the way, if you want to see that, I think a lot of you have probably seen Dutch Bushcraft's video on when they took one of the aluminum Bugouts and batoned with it and stuff like that. And it held up as well as any of the hard use knives that they've had. So most of the ragging that people do on the Bugout, I think, comes from either wanting it to be something that it's not, or just misperceptions about what it is. And there were legitimate fit and finish issues that it had in the past. The fit and finish is still not great, but the issues seem to have resolved themselves with their more modern releases. So B- in the fun factor. Function is where I thought the Bugout would honestly be a little bit better. And it was, now that I'm sort of looking at it, again, I owned a bunch of Bugouts years ago, but that was when I was just a consumer. Now that I'm looking at it a little bit more critically with sort of a knife reviewer's eye, I do see that the function is not quite as strong as I would really like it to be. And it does start with that cutting performance. The fact is, this blade starts with a great neutral blade shape and thin stock, but then kind of ruins it with a grind that just isn't that steep and a factory edge that just isn't that great. And so just as a function of how thin it is, it will cut just fine as any thin bladed object will. But especially once you're used to slicier knives, you don't get great cutting performance out of a Benchmade Bugout like you do with a well-ground knife with 90 thousandths stock. If I compare this to, again, a Delica, it does not cut nearly as well as a Delica. If I compare this to a Spyderco Dragonfly, it doesn't cut nearly as well as a Dragonfly. It cuts about as well as a Deca, but I hated the grind on the Deca as well. Doesn't cut nearly as well as an Atom, doesn't cut nearly as well as a Neutron. It's just the cutting performance is fine when it could have been good. It could have even been very good if they'd gone more aggressive. That's probably a price point thing and a production scale thing. I'm sure they can hit this depth of grind much more reliably than they could with a more aggressive grind. But that's the consequence, that cutting performance is a B and no better than a B, despite the fact that it is that thin. Utility is a B, and in fact, you know what? I was thinking about this. I'm going to do a game time decision here and make it a B minus. And part of the reason it's a B minus is, again, neutral handle, easy to grip any way you want to. Nice neutral blade shape, easy to use on anything you want. But with the sort of finickiness of the axis lock, and with how thin this blade stock is, this does feel like a fragile knife when you're using it. Now, that is totally in my head, and I know what I just said there completely contradicts what I said about the actual performance that you get out of it. The fact is, you can use this knife hard, but because of the neutrality of both the blade and the handle, it is truly a knife that is good at everything but great at nothing. For any given task, whether it's breaking down boxes, whether it's cutting twine around the house, in the garden, anything like that, this will always be a decent knife for that task. It will be decent at everything, but there will always be a better knife in your collection for any given task. Like if you look at this 940 blade shape, this reverse Tonto is a lot better for some of your utility cuts. Your drag cuts is also better for stuff like using it like a utility blade, using it for turning screws and all that sort of dumb stuff you shouldn't use knives for. The 940 is a blade that is bad at some things, but really interestingly good at some other things. The Bugout is just good at everything. And on top of that, with this thin stock and with the fact that even though it is tough, the axis lock always feels a bit fragile. It's not my issue with the scales, it's my issue with the axis lock. And that it does relatively easily develop play if you push it too hard, especially if you start putting too much pressure on it, side to side. Because this blade is thin, it will flex, and it will start to flex around that lock, and you will start to introduce some play. This is really a knife that does feel more restricted to lighter duty chores. And anytime I started to push it harder, whether that was around the house or in the garden, it did start to feel a little skeevy, and I wanted to back off and get a different knife. Again, that is mostly in my head. The knife could probably handle it, but this ended up being a knife that I kind of always wanted to carry a second knife with it, either because I wanted something with better cutting performance, so I would carry, say, a Dragonfly with it, or I wanted something a little tougher, so I would carry, say, a 940, if not an outright 3.5-inch blade like a Hinderer with it. So B minus didn't end up being as all-around versatile as I wanted it to. Feel is a solid B. I've already talked plenty about this grippery handle. It is a very nicely and thoughtfully designed neutral handle with just enough contouring, just enough shaping, just enough texture, just enough grip where you want it. This is a great handle for just about anything. If you start to push it harder, if you start to do harder use tasks, you will start to see the limitations of it. But you start to see the limitation of this whole knife in those harder use tasks. That's not really what it's meant for. And even then, because of that grip, because of that contouring, it does feel more secure in your hand, more comfortable in your hand than a lot of neutral handles do. It's ergonomically very well designed without being great at anything. Honestly, this is borderline a B+. It's very, very close to a B+ in feel because it's kind of just effortless. You know, you never think about holding the Bugout. It just kind of is always where you want it to be. It's not really a B+ because there are some other knives in that size class that have just very, very good ergonomics, but it's close. Carry is kind of part of what the Bugout is known for. The simple fact is, thin blade stock, thin handles, 1.85 ounces for 3.24 inches of knife. It carries great. This is one of those knives that does sort of disappear in your pocket. You know, if you compare it to your small Sebenza, which is a knife that carries really well, you can see it's significantly thinner and quite a bit lighter than your small Sebenza. It's a bit bigger in the pocket, but you don't really notice that when the knife is so thin and so light. It's very easy, very effortless to carry, and then that's another benefit of the Grivory scales. Because they are sort of a composite material rather than metal, they're not going to bang around on anything. They're just, the contour makes it easier to slide past stuff. This diamond pattern is not grippy enough that it sort of tears up your pocket or anything. It's just an easy knife to carry. It's a solid A in carry. It's one of the most interesting features of the Bugout. And then value, B-. The fact is, these days, you can get it most places for $162. Retail, it's listed at $180. You can probably get this for $162 just about everywhere. And the fact is, with Spyderco's prices creeping up, with Kershaw's prices, creeping up a little bit, and with where the whole knife market is going, from a fit and finish perspective, this feels a little sort of janky for $162. You would like to see a little bit more quality, again, in little things like the screws fitting flush and just not having to do as much of the little torque this screw, torque that screw, all that sort of stuff every time you disassemble and reassemble it. Like, it's just not tight like you would necessarily want in a $180 or $162 knife. It's not even as tight as, say, a PM2, which costs about the same price. But it's not terrible. The butterfly tax here is not as egregious as it could be, considering the fact that you are getting a lot of performance out of this knife. You are getting a lot of thoughtful design in this knife. I don't care, personally, that the handle is made of a cheaper material when that cheaper material is so well suited for the use case. Like, the fact is, this material is this doesn't feel like a cost-saving measure from Benchmade, their choice to use Grivory. It feels like they chose the right material for what they were trying to get the Bugout to do. Same sort of thing that, when Spyderco Seki City uses FRN for these handles, it's because they want to get that shape, they want to get that design, they want to get those contours. You can get that with an injection molded handle. This is much more expensive to do with machining. Now, when you start to get into the G10 Bugouts, when you start to do anything to modify from this base Bugout, the premiums that Benchmade charges to go to G10, to go to alternative steel, stuff like that, are astronomical. And when you go to some of the other Bugouts, other Bugout variants, whether it's the aluminum version at $300, the carbon fiber and S90V version at like $330 or something like that, the value proposition on those is terrible. And it shows in the secondary market because those tend to go for way, way less than retail. The fact is, if you can get over the sense in your head that Grivery is a cheap material and so should be on a cheap knife, and you really just think about it as Benchmade choosing the most suitable material for the use case of the Bugout, this doesn't feel terrible for $162. And there aren't, it's cheaper than those slicer knives I was talking about, cheaper than your TRMs. It is unfortunately cheaper these days than a lot of your Spydercos, at least your USA-made Spydercos. And so it's still not a good value. That fit and finish does start to sting a little bit at the prices they charge, but it's not terrible. And I can't give it any worse than a B-. And so that averages out to a B, and then the whole knife averages out to a B. And I think that is very unsurprising as a place to end with the Bugout. This is a B of a knife. This is the epitome of a pocket knife that is very good in every way. It is trying to be very good. It is great at nothing. It is interesting in virtually no ways. But it is also a gateway knife for a reason, because it is a knife that anybody can pick up, anybody can use. And I think it is a knife that has become unfairly maligned by a lot of the knife community in 2024. Because it is sort of that entry-level knife, because it chooses to use some blade steels that are a little bit cheaper, some handle materials that are a little bit cheaper, because it feels light, and we've got this stupid thing in our brain that we think that light feels cheap and insubstantial, even when the fact is you can push this knife quite a bit harder than it looks and feels like you can, and it won't necessarily break. It is a knife that was designed for a very particular purpose, and when I look at it within that context, it does everything that it has set out to do very well. The only things that I can really knock it for are a grind that is much shallower than I would like to see, and just a level of fit and finish that does start to feel a little bit behind the times. Now, the fact is, given where I am in my knife collecting journey, I'm personally not that interested in the Bugout anymore. I've got a bunch of Bugouts right now. I'm going to put together a couple other reviews of just these, some of these other scales, maybe one piece just on, scale swaps on the Bugout, how they feel, how they change the knife. But the fact is, the Bugout is fine, but if I compare it to, say, a Delica, or I compare it even more directly, size-wise, to an Indela, I just like these other knives better, in particular because the handle is ergonomically better, the slicing performance is better, and they are, on top of that, either cheaper or similar in price with markedly better blade steel. The biggest issue that the Bugout has is that I think there are just better options for exactly the thing that the Bugout does. I don't personally think that the Hogue Deca is a better option because I wasn't a big fan of the Deca, and I have not tried the Bel Air, so I can't comment on that, but I know lots of people are loving that one. But it's not a bad choice. And there is nobody for whom the Bugout is a bad choice, including knife enthusiasts. It is a very solid knife. It is a very good knife. And it is doing exactly what it intends to do. And I think that deserves quite a bit of praise, because the closer you look at it through that lens, and you look at the Bugout from the perspective of what the Bugout is meant to be, you start to see a lot more thoughtful design and a lot more intentional choices. And it looks less like a crappy knife designed to appeal to everyone. And it starts to look more like a knife that achieved what so many other knives and knife makers have tried to do, which is to make a truly universal mid-range pocket knife. The Bugout has done that in a way that I don't think any other knife has in the entire time that I've been paying attention to the knife community. Frankly, the last knife that probably got that kind of general acceptance was the Delica. And these are both classic designs for a reason, and ought to be treated as such, and ought to be given a modicum of respect as much. Even though I do like the Delica much better. So that was A lot more talking about the Benchmade Bugout than you probably heard anybody else do, and probably a lot more thought about the Benchmade Bugout than you might have heard, but that's just how I roll. Hope you found this useful. Hope you at least found it entertaining. Maybe it was just thought-provoking in some way. Maybe you think I'm full of crap. Whatever your thoughts, please let me know down in the comments. I do try to respond to comments when I can. Often it'll be a few days later just with my schedule, and I'll do them in a batch, but I do try to respond to things, so please, and if I don't get back to you right away, don't get too worried about it. I'm still learning sort of YouTube's comment systems. Some comments still get lost in the ether every once in a while, and I'm starting to get better at finding them. So, yeah, everybody's got an experience with the Bugout. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you feel. Let me know if there's any other Benchmades that you would like me to look at. I'm curious whether people care about me reviewing, say the Adira, the new Salt Series ones. I'm having a hard time caring about their existence. I've had a couple opportunities to get them on the secondary market. I've passed on it every time because it's just kind of like, why? But if folks want me to review them, then I can get a couple and play around with them, see how I like them. But it's the Bugout. You've got an opinion already. Maybe mine changed yours a bit, or maybe you just like listening to somebody for almost an hour talk about a knife that everybody already knows. Here's Ben Clark the Knife. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much for sticking around.